When Jaguar Wright finally said she was ready to talk about Claressa Shields and Papoose, the internet didn't explode. It went quiet. And that silence is what made people nervous. Because when Jaguar speaks, she doesn't chase headlines. She reframes stories people thought were already finished. She didn't tease gossip. She didn't shout accusations. She spoke about patterns, timelines, and behavior that only makes sense once you stop looking at it as chaos. When Jaguar said this story was never about rumors, but about structure, the tone shifted instantly. According to her, what looked like loyalty on the surface was actually something far more organized behind the scenes. Not mistakes, not confusion. A system that only works when everyone believes they're the only one. And that's when Claressa's public strength suddenly made sense. Because when you're defending something loudly, it's often because you're still convincing yourself quietly. Jaguar claimed warnings existed long before the internet caught on. Not public warnings, but subtle ones. Questions that didn't add up. Dates that overlapped. Excuses that sounded familiar, just delivered to different people. When the moment finally hit, it didn't happen online. It didn't happen in an interview. It happened on Christmas. A day Claressa believed was theirs, was already booked. And when Jaguar framed that moment, it stopped sounding like drama and started sounding like realization. Not a breakdown caught on camera, but the kind that happens internally when the story you've been protecting collapses all at once. When silence followed instead of denial, Jaguar said that wasn't confusion, it was calculation. So now the question isn't what was said, it's why nothing was denied. Stay locked in, because when the truth comes out in fragments, not headlines, the real collapse never happens in public. When Jaguar Wright says she's revealing the truth, she doesn't rush. She slows the room down. And that's exactly how this story around Claressa Shields and Papoose began to feel different from the moment it surfaced. According to Jaguar, this was never meant to be loud. It wasn't designed for instant outrage or trending hashtags. It was the kind of situation that stayed quiet, because quiet protected everyone involved. And when stories stay quiet for that long, they don't disappear. They settle. Jaguar framed the situation not as a scandal, but as a pattern. A pattern where public images stayed polished, while private realities grew increasingly complicated. She didn't accuse anyone of crimes. She didn't present medical claims or definitive proof. Instead, she focused on something harder to dismiss: behavior over time. From the outside, Claressa Shields looked unshakable. Champion mindset, confident presence, public support for her relationship. She posted strength, stability, and certainty, the image of someone who knew exactly where she stood. But according to Jaguar, that confidence wasn't fake. It was defensive. And there's a difference. Jaguar suggested that when people are absolutely certain, they don't over-explain loyalty. They don't need to publicly reinforce trust. The reinforcement starts when cracks are already forming privately. Not because someone is weak, but because they're invested. According to the narrative Jaguar described, quiet warnings existed long before the internet noticed anything. Not confrontations, not public call-outs, just subtle moments where timelines didn't align cleanly. Conversations that ended without clarity. Excuses that sounded reasonable until they were heard more than once. This is where Jaguar's framing became important. She didn't say Papoose was chaotic. She said he was structured. And that distinction matters. Chaos creates mistakes. Structure creates systems. According to her, what was happening wasn't random overlap. It was compartmentalization. Different emotional lanes, different expectations, different understandings of what the relationship actually was. And Claressa's lane, Jaguar implied, wasn't secrecy. It was visibility. Visibility is powerful. When the most visible person appears solid, the entire situation looks stable from the outside. Fans don't question. Media doesn't dig. Silence becomes normal. And according to Jaguar, that visibility unintentionally protected the structure underneath. The moment everything shifted didn't happen online. It happened on Christmas. Jaguar described that day not as dramatic, but devastating in its simplicity. A holiday Claressa believed was shared turned out not to be available. The explanation was framed as family obligations. Reasonable, understandable, unquestionable. Until context changed the meaning. Because according to Jaguar's commentary, Papoose wasn't unavailable. He was present elsewhere, in a space Claressa wasn't included in. And that distinction mattered more than any argument could have. Jaguar emphasized that this wasn't about jealousy. It was about position. Who is included when it counts? Who is informed after decisions are already made? Who is visible, and who is prioritized? From that point on, the public and private narratives began drifting further apart. Online, Claressa continued to look composed, supportive, loyal. The relationship appeared intact. But Jaguar suggested the emotional energy behind the scenes no longer matched what people were seeing. Plans became vague. Communication became careful. Decisions happened without discussion. And that's where Jaguar introduced one of the most uncomfortable questions of the entire story. Not as an accusation, but as reflection. Was Claressa the main partner, or just the most visible one? See, that question alone shifted how fans reinterpreted everything they had already seen. The posts, the captions, the public defense. Suddenly, moments that once felt confident started feeling heavy. Jaguar also addressed something many viewers noticed but couldn't quite articulate: the absence of denial. There were no long explanations, no detailed rebuttals, no timelines presented to clear confusion. According to Jaguar, that silence wasn't accidental. When stories aren't denied, it doesn't always mean they're true, but it often means responding would create more questions than answers. Jaguar framed silence as strategy, not fear. The less you say, the less there is to examine. The fewer words you offer, the fewer contradictions can be pulled apart. And in situations involving multiple narratives, talking too much becomes dangerous. What made this part of the story especially heavy was Jaguar's refusal to paint Claressa as weak. She didn't question her intelligence. She didn't undermine her strength. Instead, she argued something more unsettling, that Claressa's strength made the situation comfortable. Strong people are expected to endure quietly. Confident people are assumed to be fine. Public figures are expected to protect the image. And when someone fits all three, their silence is often misread as acceptance. According to Jaguar, the breakdown in this story wasn't emotional chaos. It was realization, the kind that doesn't come with tears on camera, but with a sudden understanding that the reality you defended no longer exists. By the end of part one thing became clear. This wasn't about exposure yet. It was about awareness. Once a system is seen, it can't be unseen. And the hardest part isn't what the internet says next. It's the private decision that follows. When Jaguar Wright leaned into part two of her commentary, the story stopped being about a single moment and started becoming about infrastructure. Not rumors, not screenshots, but the invisible framework that keeps complicated situations looking simple from the outside. According to Jaguar, this is where people get confused. They expect chaos when something is wrong. Loud arguments, public slip-ups, messy timelines. But what she described was the opposite. Calm, controlled, efficient. And that's why it lasted as long as it did. Jaguar framed the situation as a multi-lane system. Not one relationship going bad, but several emotional lanes operating at the same time, each with different expectations, different access, and different rules. The key wasn't secrecy, it was compartmentalization. One lane handled reassurance, another handled quiet support, another held history that never fully closed, another stayed undefined. Available, but not anchored. And then there was visibility. According to Jaguar, Claressa Shields occupied the most visible lane. That mattered more than people realize. Visibility stabilizes narratives. When the most visible person appears confident and loyal, the entire situation looks grounded. Fans don't question, media doesn't press. Silence becomes normal. Jaguar didn't suggest Claressa knew everything. She suggested Claressa knew enough to keep trusting, and that's a critical difference. Knowing fragments without context is one of the most disorienting positions a person can be in. You see things that don't quite fit, but you also see enough reassurance to doubt your instincts. This is where Jaguar introduced a psychological layer that resonated with a lot of viewers. Cognitive defense. When someone is emotionally invested and publicly supportive, questioning the foundation feels like self-betrayal. Admitting doubt doesn't just challenge the relationship, it challenges the image you've already defended. And once an image is defended loudly, walking it back becomes humiliating. Jaguar suggested this is why public confidence often intensifies right before private collapse. Not because someone is lying, but because they're still choosing belief. They're choosing the version of reality that hurts less for now. Silence played a major role here. There were no explosive denials, no detailed explanations. According to Jaguar, that silence wasn't confusion or avoidance, it was strategy. When multiple emotional lanes exist, clarity becomes dangerous. Every explanation risks contradicting another version of the story. So the safest move is minimal engagement. Say just enough to appear present. Say nothing that can be cross-examined. Let time absorb the pressure. Jaguar emphasized that systems like this don't collapse immediately once exposed. They resist. They compress. They rely on fatigue, on the idea that public attention will drift and questions will soften. This is where fans unknowingly become part of the system. When supporters argue online, defend timelines, or dismiss concerns as haters, they stabilize the narrative without realizing it. According to Jaguar, no coordinated defense is needed when the audience does it for you. See, visibility plus fan loyalty creates insulation. And Claressa's strength amplified that insulation. Strong women are rarely checked on emotionally. People assume certainty. They assume resilience. They assume silence means everything is fine. Jaguar argued that this expectation becomes a trap, because the stronger someone appears, the more damage they're expected to absorb quietly. She also addressed why the breakdown label never quite fit. This wasn't a meltdown. It wasn't a spiral. It was realization under pressure. Realization doesn't scream. It recalculates. It forces you to re-examine every moment you defended someone else's version of events. Every time you reframed inconsistencies. Every time you trusted reassurance over instinct. And Jaguar suggested, the most painful part isn't discovering something was wrong. It's discovering how long you helped keep it intact. And that brings the story back to Papoose. Jaguar didn't portray him as reckless. She portrayed him as experienced. Someone who understood when to slow things down, when to stay quiet, and when not to add details that could unravel the structure. Silence in this framing wasn't passive. It was active restraint. As Part 2 unfolded, the story stopped being about allegations and started being about choice. Not public choice, private choice. The kind no one can crowdsource. The kind that happens after the noise fades. Jaguar framed Claressa's position as a crossroads. One path requires public clarity, decisive, irreversible, identity shifting. The other requires quiet endurance, strategic silence, quiet compartmentalization, and living with knowledge that can't be unseen. Neither option offers peace. They offer different losses. And this is where Jaguar made one thing very clear. She wasn't calling for confrontation. She wasn't demanding statements. She wasn't pushing for spectacle. She was exposing a pattern, one where power is maintained through ambiguity and accountability is delayed through silence. By the end of Part 2, the audience understood something crucial. This story isn't moving forward. It's tightening. Because once a system is recognized, it doesn't collapse loudly. It waits. It watches. It applies pressure where silence has worked before. And the most dangerous moment hasn't arrived yet, because the real collapse doesn't happen when the internet reacts. It happens when the person at the center decides whether to protect the image or finally protect themselves. When Jaguar Wright pushed the story forward, she didn't introduce new names. She introduced a new phase. According to her, this is the part most people misunderstand. the moment after realization, when confusion ends and clarity begins to hurt. This is where silence changes meaning. Up until now, silence could be mistaken for patience, privacy, or maturity. But Jaguar framed this stage differently. She described it as pressure without fingerprints. No shouting, no threats. Just time. Applied strategically. According to her, once Claressa Shields understood that the narrative she'd been defending no longer aligned with reality, the emotional battle wasn't external anymore. It turned inward. And inward battles don't show up in captions or interviews. Jaguar said there's a specific moment when people stop asking, "Is this true?" and start asking, "How long has this been true?" That moment changes everything. Because once patterns repeat too cleanly, denial stops protecting you. It exhausts you. The internet calls it staying calm. Friends call it being strong. But Jaguar called it something else. Containment. Containment happens when someone feels responsible for holding everything together. The image, the narrative, the version of events they already defended publicly. And the cost of breaking that image feels heavier than the cost of staying silent. This is where humiliation enters the picture, quietly. Jaguar explained that heartbreak hurts, but humiliation paralyzes. Walking away publicly doesn't just end a relationship, it rewrites your identity. It forces you to admit that something you stood behind, loudly, was never what you believed it was. And that admission feels like failure, even when it's actually self-preservation. According to Jaguar, this is why strong people stay quiet longer than they should. Not because they're confused, but because they're calculating the damage. And while Claressa recalculated internally, the external world kept moving. There were no dramatic responses from Papoose, no detailed denials, no emotional explanations, just enough presence to show awareness, and enough distance to avoid saying anything that could be pulled apart later. Jaguar framed this not as fear, but as experience. When someone has navigated overlapping narratives before, they understand the danger of clarity. Every explanation creates new questions. Every timeline invites comparison. So the safest move becomes restraint. Say nothing. Let time soften attention. Allow silence to do the work. Jaguar emphasized that systems like this don't rush endings. They wait for fatigue. They rely on the idea that public outrage has a short attention span, that people will eventually move on. And when they do, responsibility quietly shifts to the person expected to handle it gracefully. That expectation landed heavily on Claressa, because strength became her trap. Strong women aren't checked on, they're assumed to be fine. Their silence is interpreted as confirmation that nothing serious happened. Jaguar warned against this assumption. She said silence doesn't always mean acceptance. Sometimes it means survival. And survival doesn't look pretty. It looks like emotional compartmentalization. It looks like choosing dignity over noise. It looks like carrying knowledge you can't unsee. Jaguar described this phase as the most dangerous part of the story, not because of what might be revealed, but because of what's already known. Once the system is seen, it can't be unseen, and staying inside it becomes increasingly uncomfortable. This is also where waiting becomes a weapon. Waiting pressures the person holding the emotional weight to make the first move, to be the one who speaks, the one who clarifies, the one who absorbs the backlash. Silence from the other side creates plausible deniability while amplifying the burden on the person expected to respond. Jaguar suggested that this dynamic is intentional, not cruel, but efficient. The longer nothing is said, the more the responsibility shifts away from the structure and onto the individual navigating it. By this point, the story stopped being about Christmas. It stopped being about timelines. It stopped being about who did what. It became about choice. According to Jaguar, Claressa stood at a psychological crossroads. One path required public action, decisive, visible, irreversible. The other required continued silence, strategic, controlled, emotionally costly. Neither path offered peace. They offered different scars. And this is where Jaguar made something very clear. She wasn't pushing Claressa toward a specific decision. She wasn't demanding exposure. She wasn't calling for confrontation. She was naming a pattern, one where ambiguity protects power, and clarity costs the person with the least insulation. By the end of Part 3, the word collapse took on its real meaning. This was never about tears, never about headlines, never about embarrassment. It was about the collapse of illusion. The illusion that loyalty was mutual. The illusion that visibility meant priority. The illusion that silence meant safety. Jaguar framed this as the most painful realization of all, because it forces action. Once you see the structure, you can't stand inside it comfortably anymore. And the most dangerous moment still hasn't happened. Because the real collapse isn't what the internet witnesses. It's the moment the person at the center decides whether to protect the image or finally protect themselves. When Jaguar Wright moved the conversation into what comes after realization, the story stopped being theoretical. According to her, this is where every narrative like this tightens, not because of new revelations, but because choices can no longer be postponed. By this stage, Jaguar suggested Claressa Shields wasn't confused anymore. Confusion belongs to earlier chapters. This phase was clarity, and clarity doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels humiliating, because it forces you to replay every defense you made for someone else, every explanation you offered to protect a version of reality that no longer holds. And that's where the real cost shows up. Walking away isn't just ending a relationship, it's rewriting your public identity. It's admitting that the strength you displayed was attached to something that didn't deserve it. It means accepting that people who watched you defend loyalty will now watch you undo it. Jaguar framed this as the invisible tax of public strength. The more confidently you stand behind something, the more expensive it becomes to step away from it. Staying, however, demands a different sacrifice. Staying requires compartmentalization, the ability to separate what you know from what you show. It requires silence that isn't peaceful, but strategic. And it requires living with knowledge you can't unsee while maintaining an image that no longer protects you emotionally. According to Jaguar, neither option offers relief. They offer different forms of loss. This is where behavior becomes louder than statements. There were no dramatic confrontations, no viral rebuttals, no public clarifications from Papoose. Jaguar suggested that this absence wasn't accidental. When clarity threatens structure, restraint becomes the safest move. Every word risks unraveling a carefully balanced situation. Instead, what people began to notice were subtle shifts. Who showed up and who didn't. Which plans stayed vague. Which connections cooled without explanation. Jaguar argued that behavior can't be edited, and that's why it becomes the real storyteller once silence stretches too long. People stop waiting for statements and start watching actions. And that's dangerous for systems built on ambiguity. According to Jaguar, the longer silence continues, the more it stops protecting anyone. What once preserved options begins to erode trust. Fans don't need confirmation. They need patterns. And patterns, once seen, don't disappear. This is also where public strength becomes a trap again. Strong people are expected to endure quietly, to handle it, to rise above. Said Jaguar warned that this expectation often keeps people inside situations longer than they should stay, because leaving feels like failing an audience that never asked them to suffer in the first place. She framed this not as weakness, but as misplaced responsibility. Responsibility for an image. Responsibility for calm. Responsibility for keeping things from getting messy, even when messiness would actually bring clarity. As the story reached this phase, Jaguar emphasized that the power dynamic subtly shifted. Silence stopped being neutral. It started applying pressure. Not outward pressure, inward pressure. The kind that asks the same question over and over. How long can I carry this before it costs me more than it's worth? Jaguar suggested that this is the moment most people never see. The internet debates motives. Comment sections pick sides. But the real reckoning happens privately, away from timelines and headlines. This is also where systems reveal their limits. Structures built on silence depend on everyone continuing to play their role. But once one person sees the structure clearly, staying inside it requires constant self-betrayal. And self-betrayal, Jaguar argued, always collects interest. By the end of Part 4, the narrative no longer centered on allegations. It centered on inevitability. Silence can delay outcomes, but it can't erase awareness. Images can be maintained, but they can't heal trust. Jaguar made it clear she wasn't predicting what Claressa would do next. She wasn't advocating a specific move. She was highlighting the cost attached to every option, a cost that increases the longer decisions are delayed. Because eventually, and silence stops being strategic, it becomes corrosive. And when that happens, people don't need receipts to understand what's changed. They read the energy, they feel the absence, they notice the distance. By the close of Part 4, one truth stood out. This story no longer belonged to the internet. It belonged to the person who had to live with the outcome. And once behavior starts telling the story, words become unnecessary. When Jaguar Wright brought the story toward what she described as its final phase, the tone shifted again. Not toward drama, toward inevitability. According to her, every situation built on ambiguity reaches a point where silence no longer stabilizes anything. It only exposes what people have been avoiding. This is the phase where nothing new has to be said for everything to be understood. By now, so Jaguar suggested Claressa Shields wasn't wrestling with uncertainty. She was wrestling with timing. When to move, when to speak, when to stop protecting something that no longer protected her. Because silence, while powerful at first, has an expiration date. Jaguar explained that in the early stages, silence preserves options. It gives everyone space. It delays consequences. But over time, silence starts to signal rather than shield. People stop waiting for explanations and start watching outcomes. Who appears less? Who disengages quietly? Which narratives are no longer reinforced? And that's when silence flips from strategy to evidence. According to Jaguar, this is where systems begin to fail. Not explosively, subtly. The pressure that once kept everything contained now squeezes in the opposite direction. The longer nothing is clarified, the more behavior fills the gap. This is also where delay becomes its own decision. Jaguar framed delay not as neutrality, but as maintenance, maintaining distance, maintaining appearances, maintaining an arrangement that requires constant emotional labor to uphold. And the cost of that maintenance grows quietly, especially for the person carrying the most visibility. By this point, the audience doesn't need confirmation. They read patterns. They feel energy shifts. They notice when something stops being defended. Jaguar emphasized that public narratives rarely end with announcements. They end with withdrawal, less presence, less engagement, fewer shared signals, closure without explanation. And that kind of ending is intentional. It avoids confrontation. It avoids contradiction. It lets time rewrite the story. According to Jaguar, this is why people often mistake endings for fading interest rather than deliberate distancing. But in reality, fading is sometimes the cleanest exit available when clarity would create collateral damage. She also addressed a hard truth many viewers recognized. Walking away late is harder than walking away early. Because late exits carry history. They carry defended moments. They carry explanations you once gave that you now have to sit with. And yet, staying carries its own cost. Staying requires constant emotional editing. It requires choosing silence repeatedly, even when silence starts to feel dishonest. It requires absorbing discomfort so that nothing spills outward. Jaguar argued that neither choice is clean. They're just different kinds of heavy. This is where the word collapse finally settles into its real meaning. There was never going to be a viral meltdown, never going to be a dramatic confrontation, never going to be a headline that says everything at once. The collapse was internal, the moment when the illusion stopped functioning, the illusion that loyalty was shared, the illusion that visibility equaled priority. The illusion that silence equaled safety. Once those illusions fall, the story ends whether the internet knows it or not. Jaguar made one last point that reframed everything that came before. She said the most dangerous part of situations like this isn't exposure, it's normalization. When systems built on silence last long enough, people begin to accept them as reality. They adjust, they cope, they stop expecting clarity. And that's when trust erodes permanently. According to her, this isn't a story about villains and victims. It's about power and access, about who gets insulated by ambiguity and who pays the emotional cost of maintaining it, about how often strong people are expected to endure quietly because they look capable. By the end of Part 5, one truth stood alone. Nothing that was seen can be unseen. The internet may move on. Headlines may shift. News stories may replace this one. But privately, decisions will be made. Distances will solidify. Narratives will change without explanation. And that's how this story really ends. Not with noise, but with choice. Because silence doesn't last forever. And eventually, even the strongest image stops being worth the weight it carries. Now here's where you come in. Because by this point, this story isn't about headlines, rumors, or who said what on which platform. It's about patterns. And once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. Silence stops sounding peaceful. Distance stops looking accidental. And behavior starts answering questions words never did. So ask yourself this. Was this really just a misunderstanding? Or was it a system that worked until someone saw it clearly? Do you think silence in situations like this protects people? Or does it protect structures? At what point does staying quiet stop being strategic and start being self-sacrifice? And when someone is visibly strong, do we unfairly expect them to absorb more damage without asking if they're okay? This is why stories like this don't end with statements. They end with choices. Quiet ones, private ones. Choices the internet never gets to vote on, but still feels the impact of. If you've ever defended something publicly only to realize privately that it didn't deserve your loyalty, you already understand this story more than you think. And if you've ever noticed a situation fade instead of explode, now you know why. So let's talk. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was this collapse inevitable once the pattern was seen? Was Claressa protecting love or protecting an image? And when silence lasts this long, what do you think it really means? If this breakdown made you pause, share it. If it made you uncomfortable, that's the point. And if you're still here listening, it's because part of you knows there's more beneath the surface than whatever made it to the timeline. Stay locked in, subscribe, keep watching. Because the real stories don't disappear. They just